Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Thanks to Men's Voices Ireland for the opportunity to be here with you today, guys and girls, and speak.
Say at the back, you can't hear it.
Can you hear me, guys?
No.
Yeah.
I'll shout. If you can't hear me, somebody please wave or let me know. Is that okay?
Just one thing, you can lift that microphone up a bit as well. You can't pick that mic up.
I could drop it. So, I was saying thanks to Men's Voices Ireland for the opportunity to be with you today to speak about the theme on the phenomenon of parental alienation. It's a theme that I do a little bit of work in terms of my own clinical practice, but also in terms of research. It's in the research interest of mine, and I've written an odd paper and article about parental alienation as well. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I am going to invite you to consider a couple of different themes. So the first thing I'm going to do is invite you to consider a definition of parental alienation. What's incredibly important in this space is that we're really, really clear what parental alienation is, but even more importantly, what parental alienation is not. The challenge is that if we have parents who are wrapping themselves in the cloak of parental alienation in an erroneous way, that dilutes and does a disservice to the parents who are actually experiencing the construct of parental alienation for real in their daily lives over many, many years. Okay, so I'm also going to have a look at some signs that tells us that a family may be vulnerable to parental alienation dynamics. I'm going to have a look at the idea, is it recognized? There was 172 feminist organizations and individuals made submissions to the World Health Organization over the last couple of weeks and months denigrating the construct of parental alienation. And so I think it's helpful today if we're really clear that parental alienation actually is based on solid psychological constructs from the 1950s. Let me just pull an add-on there. If you're ever in a room and somebody says to you parental alienation began in the 1980s, you're in the wrong room. You may be dealing with a well-meaning and well-intentioned practitioner, but you're still in the wrong room because you're dealing with an uninformed practitioner. So then I'm going to have some examples of what alienated children say. If we get the chance, I might introduce you to some of the systemic concepts around parental alienation, and then we might get a chance to have a quick look at the study that was completed in 2016, titled Parental Alienation Lived Experiences of Parents in Ireland. As far as I know, it is still the only study in Ireland that's been conducted on this particular theme. Okay, let's have a look. Oh yes. Let me preface everything I'm about to invite you to consider with the following. There are occasions when children will reject a parent for valid reasons, such as parental abuse or neglect. In those circumstances, it can never be parental alienation. So, there is another idea there that some children will periodically regulate and closeness and distance with each parent at different developmental stages. That is not parental alienation either. So let's have a look at what parental alienation is. It's essentially where a child will ally himself or herself strongly with one parent and reject a previously loved, normal range, healthy parent without legitimate justification. Bill Burnett there is a professor of psychiatry at Vanderbilt University in the US. That's a definition he uses. One of the key pieces about parental alienation is that it is a relational phenomenon. It's not a syndrome. There was another point I wanted to make about that. It might come back to you in a few minutes. Okay. Okay. So, some signs that says to us a family might be vulnerable to the dynamics of parental alienation. So, when a family presents with me, one of my first curiosities might be, is there or was there a protracted battle in relation to custody and access? Yes or no? Is the child's hatred disproportionate to the targeted parent? Yes or no? Did the child have a previously loving relationship with the targeted parent? That's an incredibly important piece. Very often practitioners who are faced with a child who's kicking, screaming, punching a parent will presume that that was the relationship between the child and the parent from many, many years previously. When we explored this particular piece, we discovered that actually no, there was a previously warm, loving relationship between the child and now rejected parent. There'll be plenty of photographs and videos to indicate this and so on and so forth. Okay. Anybody with children here is going to know very, very well, particularly teenagers, are really, really good at pointing out the faults of both parents, aren't they? But when we're faced with a child who says something like, Mum is always right, Dad is always wrong, or says something like, well, Mammy never uses bad language, Daddy curses all the time, but then when Mammy uses bad language, it's okay. Simple example. The idea there is that what we're seeing is reflexive support for one parent and a complete denigration of the other parent. And in a couple of slides' time, I have some examples of that for you to consider. Okay, are the reasons for rejecting the parents scripted, lacking substance and accurate detail, unlike true histories of abuse? Some specific examples of this, again, in a couple of slides' time. But for the moment, let me give you an example of a reason. So I recently had a 9-year-old female sit in front of me and tell me that under Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, she never had to see her father again if she didn't want to. That's a pretty obvious example of scripted and rehearsed and adult language, isn't it? Struck me as not being a normal part of a 9-year-old's vocabulary. Okay. Is there a distinct lack of guilt or remorse on the part of the child? Children who will present as denigrating a parent, kick them, spit, punch, so on and so forth, there will be a remarkable absence of guilt on the part of the child in those moments. That brings us to the idea of counterintuitives. There's 88 counterintuitives for professionals and practitioners working in this space. And we have to overcome each of those 88 counterintuitives if we are going to see the dynamic that is actually right under our nose. Okay, let's move on. Is it recognized? A lot of denigrators, such as those 172 agencies and professionals that I mentioned that were making submissions to the World Health Organization recently, will say that parental alienation is junk science, is one of the things they'll say. They say it doesn't exist. Some of them might say things like it's a construct that is used to punish women who are naturally, by virtue of their gender, the expert parents on all children. The facts are really quite different. For example, Charles Dickens is said to have alienated his wife from their children in the 1840s. Thank you for that. So the reality is quite different. Parental alienation has been around for a significant period of time. For example, Charles Dickens back in the 1840s, is said to have alienated his children from his wife when he met a new lady. Some other examples would be, well, you can Google this one. The Earl of Westmeath alienated his children from his wife, the Countess of Westmeath. That was in 1850. It's a legal case. Google it, you'll see it. Albert Einstein was probably the first to mention alienation in 1914 when he wrote about his relationship between his children and himself when his marriage to Elsa disintegrated. And so, let's come forward a few years. Back in 1997, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists, the US, published practice parameters for their members, specifically dealing with parental alienation. So to the denigrators who say it's never been recognized by a professional organization, You simply have to go back to 1997. Kafkas in the UK, coming forward another few years. Last year, I think, or maybe the year before, Kafkas in the UK, they too published practice parameters for their social workers dealing with parental alienation. Their CEO publicly acknowledged this during a conference in the last 12 months or so. The DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, many barristers and solicitors often say to me during cross-examination, it doesn't exist in the DSM. I say, excuse me, you need to look at page 716, 718, 719 of the DSM, where you will see pieces such as child affected by parental relationship distress, child psychological abuse, and a number of other labels. The committee, back in 2013, who were putting together, the subcommittee who were putting together this piece in the DSM were very clear. They consider parental alienation to be a relational phenomenon, and therefore the label child affected by parental relationship distress, and so on and so forth. Earlier this year, in May, the World Health Organization published a draft of its International Classification of Diseases, it's the 11th edition. They have specifically indexed parental alienation under child, parent, caregiver problem. Google it, you'll find it, no problem. And a couple of other labels in there as well. 2 weeks ago, Derry County Council passed a motion acknowledging parental alienation and locating it in the space of domestic violence and child welfare. Which brings me to another point. Parental alienation is a child welfare issue. It is psychological and emotional child abuse. It needs to be seen as such, and it needs to be responded to by professionals and agencies in the same way that we respond to all other types and forms of child abuse. Can you still hear me at the back, guys? Okay. And then, actually, I think about a week ago, 10 days ago, there was an Oireachtas review of family law. I can't remember the page numbers, but that particular family law review has referenced alienation as a challenge. Okay, let's have a look at the voice of the child. It was alluded to earlier on that the voice of the child can be misrepresented. And that Article 12 I was talking about earlier is the piece of legislation that apparently, well, not apparently, but that it actually is based upon. Alienating parents will typically say, I'll let the child go in and speak to the judge. It's an incredibly harmful thing to do to a child. I have an idea that there's very good reasons why we do not allow children to smoke, drink alcohol, vote, join the army, and so on and so forth. And yet, when it comes to the crucial area of family relationships, we have uninformed social, legal, and mental health practitioners holding their hands up in the air and saying, that's okay, the child has said it never wants to see this parent ever again, without even asking why. And so, the impacts on the children who are placed into these intolerable loyalty conflicts and double bind situations are pervasive and last across their lifespan. And it transcends generations, and so we see these patterns re-emerging in the future families of creation of these young people. Okay, so for me, I have an idea. It's incredibly important that you be able to differentiate between the expressed wish and feeling of a child versus the ascertainable wish and feeling of a child. In cases of parental alienation, there will be a tremendous difference there. The expressed wish will be a wish that is being presented as a result of undue influence and coercive control. When you know what you're looking for, it's incredibly easy to tell the difference. It's incredibly easy to spot this dynamic. It emerges in the room very clearly. And the good news is we now have an evidence-based model that can help us establish definitively the absence or presence of parental alienation in a family at a given moment in time. The model has been around for in excess of 30 years. It's currently being published in a new book that we're launching at our conference in Croke Park on April 21 next. And it's called the 5-factor model.
Sorry,
Yes?
And Chair, you wanted to say the name of this?
The 5-factor model.
5 factors.
Yes, it's been published as we speak by a fellow called Professor Bill Burnett and a Dr. Dimos Lorandos. As I say, it's been around 30 years. The individual components of this assessment have been around for in excess of 30 years. They've just never been presented in this particular way before. So we also have the 8 symptoms in a child, and we have the 17 strategies that alienating parents use. So, you don't have to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist to bring families and young people through this. That's one of the key benefits. It provides us with an opportunity here in Ireland to have one cohesive approach to identifying the absence and presence of parental alienation in families, and it's evidence-based. Okay, let's move on, in case I digress and ramble. Okay, so what do alienate children say? So one of the first things, I suppose, that always strikes me is a child was presented and said, I never want to see him or her ever again. I'm curious when the child stopped using the name mum and dad. They'll refer to the parent as it, him or her. Ah yes, then there's that idea too. So I was saying to advise the child earlier, very often the parent will say something like, well, what can I do if little Johnny or little Mary doesn't want to go and see daddy? And I do say to them, well, if little Johnny or little Mary didn't want to go to school tomorrow, would that be okay? And they come back very quickly and say, of course not, because education is important. And I say, so the relationship between the child and the father is less important? They very quickly tie themselves up in knots. Which brings me to another point for practitioners in this area. You are routinely subjected to complaints by dissatisfied alienating parents to your professional body. Okay.
Sorry, you're routinely what?
Routinely subjected to complaints to your ethics committee or fitness to practice committee of your professional body by dissatisfied alienating parents. Okay. And indeed, there are a certain type of legal practitioner who will also encourage these kind of behaviours. I recently had a parent in front of me and he said to me, mindful of the camera. Okay, let's move on. Okay, where was I?
I could turn the microphone off if that would be
You're still wondering what he said to you.
Okay, I'll come back to it at the end, maybe during questions and answers. Okay, okay, so, yes, I think I've mentioned those points there. Okay, let's move on. Yes, the child will typically say, I feel unsafe, I feel scared, and I feel angry when I see him. 10-year-old male said that to me one day. Another example is, I do not need her in my life. That was another, obviously. The children themselves will say, I will tell the judge I never want to see him ever again. And when you ask them, well, can you help me understand that a little bit more, they'll say something like, well, he abuses me. And then you might be curious and go, can you help me understand that a little bit more? And they'll say, well, he makes me clean my room, he makes me empty the dishwasher, he makes... Normal range parenting practices are reframed as abuse. The difficulty I often wonder is that a lot of practitioners, when they hear the word abuse, they default to a different space. And they don't even explore that any further. Okay. Yes, there's another good example about grandparents. Just let me go to the side. Let me digress slightly there for a minute. Not only is the parent erased from the lives of these children forevermore, but one entire side of that parent's family is also erased. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins are forever torpedoed. One example, or one excuse that a child gave me, a 12-year-old female gave me one day, was that my mum's grandparents spoil us, and it's not good for children to be spoiled by their grandparents. What else did I say? I've mentioned the first one there, the Article 12. The second one there, 10-year-old female said to me one day, I have dreams of him strangling me. I was wondering what was said to that child for this to intrude on her unconscious in this way. There is, it's well established that the narratives that are constructed about the parent are very much about portraying a normal range healthy parent as unsafe and dangerous at every opportunity. Okay. Oh yeah, in relation to the voice of the child, I also have an idea that the child's voice is simply that. It is a voice, but it's not a choice. I have an idea that the child's voice cannot be considered to be decisive in these matters. Okay. So what kind of tactics do the alienating parents use? As I mentioned earlier on, there's 17 of them in the literature. Dr. Amy Baker is a famous clinical psychologist in the US. She's the lady responsible for demonstrating the evidence base and research evidence base around those 17 strategies. Okay, so number one would be we would have one parent unreasonably interfering with the time that the child spends with the targeted parent. Be eradicating the targeted parent from the child's life. And eradicating, is an understatement. These parents are pathologically determined to erase the parent from the child or children's lives forever. They're not playing for temporary pieces here. And one incredibly successful tactic to achieve that is to make false allegations of abuse against the other parent. Dads will typically allege physical and emotional abuse against mums, and mums will typically allege sexual abuse against dads. And what happens? Services and agencies naturally have to investigate these allegations to establish the veracity or otherwise of them. The difficulty is oftentimes services and agencies are incredibly overworked and incredibly underfunded. And it can take up to 12 months or more for these investigative processes to reach a conclusion. And in that time, the contact between the child and the alienated parent is terminated. And so what we're actually doing is perpetuating the alienation. Okay, so false allegations of abuse, I've touched on that. How often are false allegations of abuse in this space? Would anybody care to throw a guess out, a percentage? Don't be shy.
95%.
Sorry?
95%.
95, okay, 95%. Anyone else? Thank you for that.
75.
75. Somebody give me one more.
25.
25.
Yeah, big win.
40 to 50.
40 to 50. Okay. The literature tells us quite clearly that in cases of alienation, the allegations of abuse will be false in 80% of those cases. Okay, what else have we got? Inappropriately disclosing adult information. That is one way that these parents will use to recruit the child into an alliance with the alienating parents with the express intention of excluding the targeted parents. Okay. There's one source, 1991 source of my claim to 80% of the cases. And it's not just, it's not me pulling figures out of the sky here. There's a number of authors there over a rather long period of time saying similar pieces. Professor Jennifer Harmon in Texas recently conducted a study across the US and Canada. She wanted to try and figure out what is the occurrence rate of parental alienation. And what she found was 6.7% of the US and Canadian population have been impacted by the dynamics of parental alienation. I can't remember the figures offhand, but it equates to something like 22 million adults in the US alone. But one interesting piece that jumped out at me on the page is that at 6.7%, that places parental alienation at 3 times the rate of autism in the general population. And when we consider the multidisciplinary responses to autism, and here we have a phenomenon, an incredibly harmful phenomenon for children, that's 3 times that rate of autism. And there are relatively no supports and resources in place for families and young people navigating this. Okay, how am I doing for time? Have I 10 minutes left?
Yeah, give it 10.
Okay. Gender. Okay, so for about 50 years or a little less, lots of academics got into wonderfully flowery arguments in language about parental alienation and gender and so on and so forth. I have an idea that parental alienation is not a gendered issue. I have an idea it's a child welfare issue. I'm not really that interested in my work. I'm not really that interested in the rights of mothers or the rights of fathers. I am interested in the rights of children to have a quality relationship with both parents that optimizes the outcomes for these children, not just now, but across their lifespan. Okay, when we're dealing with parental alienation, it is not a child custody and access issue. It is not a normal family law issue. It is a child welfare issue. Okay. Any family therapists in the room? 1, 2, okay. So you guys will know some of those names on that slide. Okay. So Richard Gardner is one contributor in the mid-1980s to the theme of parental alienation. However, he added a third word on that created incredible debate that diverted attention away from providing supports and resources to families to academic debates about is it a syndrome or is it not a syndrome. The contemporary literature today is very, very clear. The ICD, the DSM, so on and so forth, it's a relational phenomenon and therefore not a syndrome. Okay. And earlier on, when I was referencing the solid psychological constructs dating from the 1950s, I was thinking of some of those guys there in that list. These guys, within the systemic pieces, these guys have been very famous practitioners, theorists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. So for any of the denigrators out there, and I recently put a video together to those 172 feminists who attacked the WHO recently, and I invited them specifically to provide the research evidence to me that says parental alienation is junk science. How many responses have I got to that invitation from any of those 172 denigrators? Zero. It went out across, I put it up on our platform, Parental Alienation Europe. It went out across all our social media platforms. Not one response. Okay. Which is a shame, because actually I really enjoy and welcome informed debates and discussions about the construct of parental alienation. But they saw it.
There are a lot of family therapists, but you're one, I'm one of systemic one, who are feminists as well. I brought the point this morning, I really still go on about relentless because I don't understand that.
Yeah.
The concept of triangulation we use all the time.
Yes.
Systemic practitioners are also feminists. Sorry.
Questions? We'll have a question and answer
Yeah, no, I
session.
know.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on.
Sorry.
Okay. So guys, when we're in conversations with professionals and they are, you say the word alienation and their eyes glaze over and their ears shut down. If you're using these terms, they cannot be dismissed because they're based on solid psychological constructs. Perverse triangles is one, pathological triangles. The cross-generational coalitions, Bateson's double bind, enmeshed parent-child dyads, and so on and so forth. Which is why I have an idea that systemic theory and practice is uniquely placed to identify and intervene effectively with these families. Okay. Oh Lord, what do I do now? Oh, it's back. I'm not sure whether I'll go through. Will I go through some of the themes on this study quickly, maybe?
We'll give you 5.
You give me 5. Okay. Okay, so guys, the study was a qualitative IPA study. That's interpretative phenomenological analytic study. Evelyn Gordon was the research supervisor, and ethical approval was given by the Research Ethics Committee at UCD. It was conducted in 2016, and there were 6 professionals, parents involved, 5 dads, 1 mum. Okay, They were aged 44 to 57 and they were living across urban and rural Ireland. Semi-structured interviews, standard practice in the research piece, and there was a number of themes that emerged from these parents' lived experience. First was being labelled a bad parent, being denied contact with their young people, loss and being suicidal, and their experience of social and legal professions. Okay. These slides, guys, I can make these available afterwards. Email me on brian@changes.ie or brian@parentalalienation.eu, and I can send them on to you because I'm mindful of time. I don't have time to go through them now. These narratives are powerful but in the way that they describe these parents' experiences. You know? Some of them relate to court orders there, that they would have had one or multiple court orders and they were still basically told to go away. You go to Garda stations, they're told, sorry, it's a civil matter, go to your solicitor on Monday morning. The participants were able to tell me about the children being removed from schools and relocated to different parts of the country without their knowledge and consent. Loss was the big piece. What we had here was participants who, they were normal range, healthy, loving parents, and they were being denied, their identity as a parent was being deconstructed in the most horrific of ways, and that identity was being reconstructed to say that they were in some way a danger to their children. Okay, let's have a look-see. That particular one there, the first one refers to a mother who was the participant. Let's move on. Suicide was a constant theme for all these parents. That's some of the points they've had to say. I'll move on quickly because I'm mindful of time, guys. The social and legal professionals. A lot of the participants would say to me, all I was ever asked, the first question I was ever asked by a solicitor is, what are your assets? One participant said they spent €25,000 in legal fees, another one said they spent €40,000 in legal fees. This is all trying to have contact with their children. €88,000 in legal fees. In my practice at the moment, I'm meeting parents who spent €200,000 to €300,000 in legal fees, trying to maintain contact with their children, unsuccessfully. Okay, there's some conclusions. There's that idea that these parents are also in a double bind. If they pursue a relationship with their children, are being labelled as insensitive to their children's feelings, and if for reasons of mental health or finance they decide to let go, they're then labelled as abandoning their children. Some professionals will have an idea that these dynamics are a routine, transient bump in the journey of relationship breakdowns. That's an uninformed position and understanding. Informed practitioners know very, very well that when relationships between a child and a parent are fractured in this way, the chances of spontaneous reunification in later years is remote. Okay, let's see. Okay, so just some ideas around a solution. I thought it wouldn't be helpful to stand here today waving a flag about the problem without making some effort to reference some solutions. So, actually, the solution there's a number of solutions, and they're quite easy to integrate into Ireland. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. One piece that we can do is simply look at Israel and what they've done in navigating and tackling parental alienation. They have an evidence-based approach as well. There's the Judge Philip Marcus, 30 years in family law courts in Israel. He'll be coming to Ireland to speak at our conference to tell us a little bit more about that. But essentially, one of the key pieces that they do is they have what they call a specialist service unit in every family law court in Israel. It's comprised of 3 or 4 mental health professionals. One of them will be a social worker. And when a parent or a family presents for the first time to the family law courts in Israel, they don't get to see the judge. They get put in front of one of these professionals. That professional will use the evidence-based model of identification and assessment to establish whether parental alienation is a factor in this case or not. If parental alienation is a factor in a case, that is then fed into the judge. And the judge from day one can start making the firm proactive orders that are required in these cases to ensure that contact failure does not progress between the child and the parent. So then there's ideas around primary prevention, so awareness. I often think it wasn't that long ago, certainly for me, when you could drink and drive a car in this country. It was perfectly acceptable. However, today we have a very different attitude. So I often wonder, how can we apply what worked well there to the concept or construct of parental alienation? Then there's the ideas around secondary prevention. I've mentioned these there a moment ago. Early identification and intervention using the evidence-based models. Training for professionals. All frontline professionals working with young people and families should be using the 5-factor model in their work with families and young people who are navigating divorce and separation. Okay, so for more information, guys, have a look at our platform, parentalalienation.eu. Sign up to the database there. It's free. But what you can be certain of is all the information, all the articles and the literature in the reference database is contemporary, it's peer-reviewed, and it's accurate. Also, could I just draw your attention to the petitions? There's a petition to make parental alienation an offence. Could I invite you to have a look at that and perhaps add your signature to it? There's about 2,000 signatures on it at the moment. And there's a YouTube video. I can't remember why I put that in there. There's a YouTube video there as well. Okay, guys, thank you for your time. I'm not sure how much time we have for questions.